Welcome, everyone, to our webinar, Regulating Gene Editing, a Case for Public Engagement. Normally, when I wake up in the morning of one of our sessions, I have a pretty good idea in my head of what I'm going to say as an introduction. And today, unfortunately, was not one of those days. And as I was reflecting on this, I think it's because citizen engagement, and that is meaningful citizen engagement in the regulatory process, is a road that's much talked about, but not much traveled. And that's a cause of a certain amount of frustration and bafflement to groups like ourselves, who in one way or another have spent years advocating for greater citizen involvement in the GMO discussion. So how is it that something that the majority of stakeholders believe is so important is still so far from becoming a reality? Today's webinar coincides roughly with the release of a report which A Bigger Conversation has just produced called Voices from the Ground, Public Engagement in the Regulation of Agricultural Gene Editing. And I'll put a link to that in the chat in a minute. And in that report, we took the time to review some of the literature around public engagement, of which there is a huge amount. And we were looking for clues about things like how we encourage and structure greater citizen engagement in regulatory decisions. What countries have followed a path of bringing citizens into that discussion? What point are citizens being involved? Is it as a single point in the process or at multiple points along the way? And what counts as citizen engagement? Is it anonymous public consultations, or are there examples of more proactive involvement in the decision-making process? We were looking for examples of how citizens were being involved. Is it as individuals or grassroots groups or consumer forums or stakeholder meetings, or through formal bodies like NGOs, which are sometimes used as citizen proxies? And particularly how those who are involving citizens are working to get the balance right between the so-called professionals and the lay public. So where does the power lie? Who is being asked to compromise, and who gets to decide what the trade-offs are? And one of the advantages of webinars like this is that we get to kind of explore and poke around issues like this that are not necessarily part of the day-to-day discussion around issues like GMOs. And what you realize when you start to look at these issues is that this is a highly complex and deeply nuanced subject, which may be one reason, definitely not all of the reasons, why there is more philosophizing about citizen engagement and why it's important than there is practical work being done on bringing citizens into the discussion. So we are very lucky today to have 4 panelists who have been actively involved in bringing citizens into the regulatory discussion around technologies such as genetic engineering technologies, but also nanotechnology. And we're very much looking forward to hearing what they have to say about what citizens bring to the table, what the benefits are, but also what the complications and the challenges are, and really where we need to go from here. As always, we try not to overcomplicate the format. Each of our speakers will have a short time to talk about the work that they do and the things that they've found. We'll have some brief dialogue between our speakers, and then we're going to open the floor to you, our audience, to ask questions and to comment and to drive this discussion forward. So feel free to use the chat. But if you have a specific question for our panelists, please make sure you use the Q&A box. You'll see that button at the bottom of your screen, and that makes sure that we can easily see any questions that you have. We are more than happy for you to post links, and we will be sending a copy of the chat and the questions to everyone who has registered for this event so that they can reread it or catch up. And of course, this event is also being recorded, and you will get a link to that as well as soon as we can get that video up on our YouTube page. And we'll also be sending out to some suggested reading to all of our registrants, so that this is an issue that you can continue to think about. And I think with that admin over, we can probably get started. Our first speaker today is Michel Pimbert. Professor Pimbert is director of the Center for Agroecology, Water and Resilience at Coventry University. He's an agricultural ecologist by training and with a special interest in inclusive governance. He is a widely published author whose work includes a recent paper on citizen engagement on the role of GMOs in Mali. Michel.
Thank you, Pat. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much to Pat and Lawrence for organizing this important event. I'm going to focus on the work I've done with colleagues on democratic deliberation on GMOs and the future of farming in Mali. I'll first describe a little bit of the context and briefly describe the approach. Then I'd like to reflect on the impacts with you, and then possibly highlight some challenges that are common to these kinds of mini publics and forms of public engagement. So I'm going to take you to southern Mali in the region of Sikasso, which is a major cotton producing area. And cotton in Mali is used as a fiber for textiles, but it's also a source of food. Cotton oil is widely used in cooking. And at the time this mini public, this deliberative process took place, there were plans to introduce and scale up the production of BT cotton. And some of the major stakeholders involved were the seed corporations, Monsanto and Syngenta, biotech scientists, as well as farmer organizations. Now, this citizen space, which I'll, capture in the word citizen jury, the citizen jury was held in Sikasso. It was really an unprecedented event in West Africa that allowed 45 farmers, both men and women, to make policy recommendations after considering expert evidence from different sources on the pros and cons of GM cotton. And after a year-long preparatory process, the citizens' jury took place over 5 days and was organized under the auspices of the regional government of Sikasso. And the entire citizen jury process was overseen by an independent panel of observers that was chaired by the former Minister for Territorial Administration in the government of Mali. And the role of this independent oversight panel was to assess the credibility, the fairness, the competence, the trustworthiness of the citizen jury process and its outcomes. So the 45 farmer jurors were divided into small groups that reflected differences in gender and the social status of farmers. And that allowed for 4 parallel juries, 10 to 13 farmers each, to run side by side during this deliberative process. And each of these 4 mini publics acted as an enabling space for farmers with different levels of wealth and social status. So we had small, medium, and large producers. And we had an all-women's jury which worked in parallel with these 3 all-male mini publics. Most of the women were small farmers. So after carefully listening to the evidence given by 14 specialist witnesses from Europe, Africa, and Asia, the jurors deliberated amongst themselves, and they decided against the introduction of GM cotton in Mali. And they not only categorically rejected GM cotton, they also asked for a fundamental reorientation of public research away from a focus on input-intensive farming and the development of new GM seeds. Because in their opinion, public research should instead support agriculture which does not require high chemical inputs and GMOs. And research instead should improve local seeds and prioritize the development of local markets and local food systems that actually enhance agricultural biodiversity. Now, in terms of impact, this citizen jury really had a considerable impact on policy and practice in West Africa. The outcomes of the citizen jury significantly changed national policy on the release of GM technology. The jury's recommendations led to a government decision not to introduce genetically modified cotton in farmers' fields in Mali. Now, this is important because overall, it's noteworthy that citizen juries and other mini-publics rarely directly influence policymaking and institutional choices. Examples of citizen juries that have had a direct impact on decision-making on GMOs include this West African case study, the Sikasso citizen jury, and another one in South India. However, according to John Dryzek, who's been studying deliberative processes around the world, these and other positive examples, and I quote, are outnumbered by cases where a mini-public is established, but turns out to have little or no effect on public decision-making. So why in this instance, why was this successful? I think there were at least 5 factors that played a role in enabling this relative success. First, civic rights at the time were respected in Mali. Freedom of speech, right to assembly, freedom of the press. It's not the case today, but when this took place in 2006, this was certainly true. And second, the citizen jury deliberations and recommendations were made highly visible in real time thanks to media involvement, press, radio, and television. And this ensured that the deliberations and the whole process was not hidden from view, as is usually the case. And that helped socialize the debate on GMOs more widely in streets, cafes, bars, marketplaces, offices, and neighboring villages and towns. So, for example, reporters from 7 community radio stations were present, one from each of the 7 districts of the Sikasso region, and the local radio stations were also present each day and were closely involved in the citizen jury, recording and broadcasting both during the preparatory phase and the event itself. And the radio broadcasts were heard at least by 1.7 million people, 1.7 million people in Mali's Sikasso region, and also in some neighboring districts of Burkina Faso and the Ivory Coast. So it had a massive impact in terms of socializing the debate on GMOs. The third factor is perhaps that farmers' juries' recommendations were brought to the attention of decision makers. Farmer-led briefings and discussions took place with all 8 regional governments of Mali, whose representatives met in Bamako, the capital city. And similarly, the findings were brought to the National Assembly, where elected deputies debated on the jury recommendations with the Minister of Agriculture and Environment. And that parliamentary debate and cross-party opinion were key in persuading the national government to ban the field release of GM cotton. A fourth factor is that there was a strong mobilization of civil society and farmer organizations, which maintained pressure on the Malian government to not allow the release of GM cotton in the field, including for experimentation. So these peasant organizations, these social movements were powerful enough to offer some resistance to the marginalization of farmers' voices in policy processes. And the final factor, I think, is the fact that this citizen jury of Sikasso was actually part of a long-term participatory process designed to enable hitherto excluded farmers and citizens to have more say in the choice of policies and technologies that influence their lives. So very briefly, over a 5-year period, there were 3 citizen juries organized in Mali. The one I've just mentioned, but 2 others on the priorities and governance of agricultural research in West Africa. So the citizen jury was part of a much larger, more open-ended political process in which jurors and other citizens engaged in a broader debate on societal choices. I just want to mention a few challenges that I think are common to all these forms of public engagement and mini-publics. I'll just list them here. We'll probably come back to them in our conversation. I don't want to use up more time than I've been given, but one of the common challenges to make these sorts of processes happen is, in the first place, overcoming prejudice about people's knowledge and capabilities. The view that, farmers, women, people of color are ignorant and they can't say anything intelligent about technical complex issues. That's the realm of scientists, just to summarize. And that's not a caricature. This is often what one hears. The second is, which is a huge challenge, the policy spaces that close down debates or co-opt citizen juries. I'm sure we'll hear more about this afterwards. The third one is simply ensuring that jury recommendations are debated by decision makers rather than ignored. And then the final one is a huge challenge. How do you achieve enduring impacts for social change, for transformation, which often has to go beyond a single technology focus to much more systemic transformations. And I'll leave it at that, because that can nicely lead us into our conversation once we've heard from my colleagues online. Thank you very much, Pat.
Thank you, Michelle. And that does actually seg quite nicely into, I think, what Sarah is likely to say. There is this perception, of course, that there is only one kind of expertise. And I think clearly we all bring our own expertise to these issues. And Sarah, I think you're going to talk about that. Our next speaker up is Sarah Hartley, who is a professor of technology governance at the University of Exeter. She is a qualitative social scientist studying efforts to open up governance to new actors through case studies involving global health, sustainable agriculture and conservation, and most recently, gene drive technology. Sarah.
Thanks, Pat. So I wanted to actually not talk about agriculture today. I'd like to introduce you to a new technology that's being recommended in the field of conservation, and it's one that's really at the very early stages. So it's important, I think, to get that conversation happening right now. So gene drive is a type of genetic engineering or type of genome editing where it's designed to spread a specific trait through a whole population of animals. So rather than traditional inheritance, where if you had a genetic modification and an animal reproduces, its offspring have a 50% chance of getting that genetic trait. Well, in a gene drive, that's changed to a 100% chance in the ideal technical world. We think it's less than that, and it's science is still a little uncertain, but the idea is within 3 or 4 generations, certainly in insect development, that you would have the whole wild population would be changed. So that's the goal of it. It's much more dramatic than genome editing and gene drive, and certainly the fact that it can spread so rapidly is both attractive to some and via others. Now it's still in the area of conservation, it's still very novel. There's 2 gene drive applications in development at the moment. One looking to eradicate rodents off islands, so creating gene drive mice or gene drive rats, and the other is in mosquitoes to stop the passing of avian malaria to endangered birds in Hawaii. There are, however, about 8 other applications at very early stages or being explored at the moment, and one of those is gene drive grey squirrels here in the UK. Now, that's being developed, or the idea is being developed at the Roslin Institute. There's no lab work being done at the moment, so no biological work on the gene drive squirrel, but there has been a few years now of work on modeling to try and understand whether it would be efficacious, whether it would work, what the risks might be, how it might spread, etc. So it's a kind of proof of concept work that's been done, and the European Squirrel Initiative is calling for funding of this research and the development of gene drive squirrels. Now, they argue that the research could be humane, cost-effective solution to the problem of grey squirrels, but it also could be applicable to other alien or non-native species, and they argue that potentially of huge environmental benefit for the country. So this is not just about the squirrels, it's a bigger conversation, if you like, if I can borrow that term, Pat, about the role of genome editing in wild species in the UK. Now, most of my work at the moment has been on gene drive mosquitoes in sub-Saharan Africa, but I saw squirrels as a chance to open up a conversation in the UK about this technology. because when you talk about gene-drive mosquitoes, it's much harder for the British public to identify with the issues. But with squirrels, everybody has something to say about grey squirrels. They either love them or they hate them, but they see them a lot. And now we know it's Britain's most seen mammal. So this was a way for me to start to explore this and open up this conversation. The gene-drive community has been quite vocal in its commitment to public engagement and knowledge co-production. And it's that aspect of gene-drive that I've been studying, I'd say, for the last 8 years now, since gene-drive really became a phenomenon in its own right. But my work is not focused on publics or citizens, but on knowledge. So I'm interested in the range of knowledge that gets to shape these technology trajectories. So I look at knowledge co-production, and that requires us to contextualize emerging technologies. So it's not just looking at the contextualization of the technology, but looking at the problem we're trying to solve. So contextualizing technology involves engaging with actors who possess knowledge about the problem we're trying to solve. So in my case, I wanted to touch base and explore with people who were experts in grey squirrel eradication or grey squirrel management in the UK, because these people have knowledge about the problem that gene-drive squirrels is designed to solve. And it's that problem framing which is increasingly problematic in technology. And I've studied this elsewhere in looking and trying to understand NGO opposition to agricultural biotechnologies. And one of my findings is that NGOs, it's not just the technology which is the problem, but it's actually the framing of the problem of agricultural, the kinds of futures we imagine for agriculture in the UK, which are contested, and therefore not just the technology. So we want to go and explore grey squirrel management in the UK. The other thing is that developers of technology, gene-drive developers in particular, have been calling for conservationists to get engaged with the technology. And I'd like to flip that around, and I'm going to call for developers to get engaged with conservation, because that's the way we get better technology development that can actually solve the problem, if indeed that's desirable. So, we used anticipatory engagement methodologies, and we use them upstream. So as I said, this is not a biological, there's no biological work at the moment, so it's very, very upstream. And we held focus groups with a range of experts in grey squirrel management. That included a focus group on woodland and land management, so people like the Royal Forestry Society, British Association for Shooting and Conservation, Forest Research, Forestry Commission, etc. We had another focus group on red squirrel conservation, including members of the UK Squirrel Accord, the National Wildlife Management Centre, the Wildlife Trusts. We had experts on invasive species management from Natural England, from various invasive species initiatives in England and in Scotland. And then we had experts on animal ethics and protection. So things like RSPCA and others who are concerned with animal welfare and animal rights. And we throughout these focus, when we completed the focus groups, we organized the findings into 4 themes around the ethics, social, scientific, and governance aspects. Now we know grey squirrels are a problem for 2 primary reasons. One is they're a problem for woodland management because they strip the bark off trees, and we know that a lot of people involved in woodland management are changing the kinds of trees they plant because of squirrels. And this issue has become more prevalent in light of the government's policies to plant trees as a aim of achieving net zero. It's put tree planting on the map, if you like. And the other is red squirrel conservation, because grey squirrels push red squirrels out of their habitat, but also bring new diseases. And we found that on the ethical side, there were lots of concerns about repeating past mistakes with technological solutions to the problem. So this idea, there wasn't a woman who swallowed a fly. This was a common narrative around this sort of creating new problems by repeating the same pattern. There was also comparison to more natural solutions. Things like the pine marten might be more desirable. There were comparison to existing methods. So stakeholders didn't view this in isolation. They understood the current methods in practice and were comparing this technology to existing methods. There were concerns about creating male-only populations. And this is because the gene drive is designed to have only, so that animals only have males. So there'd be a lot of male squirrels in the environment before gray squirrels were eradicated. And even that word eradication, there was a lot of desire to talk about control rather than eradication, and a fear about eradication, much more support for control. There was concern about vilifying a species, about vilifying squirrels. There were concerns that it would be much more challenging in squirrels than it would be, say, in global health, where there's much more ethical support for eliminating malaria than there would be for eliminating gray squirrels. On the social side, there was some concern whether gray squirrels were even an invasive species. They are labeled an invasive species by the British government, but some people felt that gray squirrels have been here so long that they were no longer a non-native species. So there was a challenge to that naming. They were also the UK's one of the UK's, they are the UK's most cited mammal, and so there was definitely a concern that it would not get a lot of public support because people loved grey squirrels. They wanted to see them in their parks. They wanted to see them in their gardens. So there was a concern whether there'd be public support for such a technology. When we get to the science, there was certainly a lot of focus around efficacy. Now, this is whether it would work or not. Now, in risk assessment terms, we define efficacy quite narrowly in terms of technical efficacy. So does the gene drive function the way we want it to? But stakeholders talked about it in much broader terms. Like, will it actually bring the red squirrel back? So they wanted to see it, the efficacy measured in terms of its ability to solve the problem rather than a technical, does it work in the lab? Which is something that we could certainly have more of a conversation about with these genomic technologies of conservation. Risk assessment, there were lots of concerns about risk assessment, lots of great questions about the limits of modeling and whether, you know, when we move to if we move to the biological, what that would look like and what kinds of risks to be involved. One of the significant risks is around spread. So what would happen if one of these gene drive squirrels went to North America where they're native? Would they then eradicate North American gray squirrels? So there were lots of concerns about cross-boundary movement of these organisms and the potential risk to other countries and other ecosystems. And then they got to governance, and landscape control is a major problem for gray squirrel management. And so some people saw the gene drive squirrel as a potential solution, a landscape control solution, because there aren't any solutions at the moment which operate at the landscape control, a landscape level. So the idea is you could release one of these squirrels and you wouldn't need to manage what was happening in the next woodland. It would just take over and it would be managed essentially by the squirrels themselves through their own mating practices. So this was highly appealing to some people and highly fearful for others. So it is, but it's certainly one of the talking points which we don't see in standard genomic technologies because of its ability to spread. We also saw in governance strong desire to talk about these technologies in context of existing management tools. So all the people who are involved in grey squirrel management were also very aware of the current management tools, and they wanted to see it in that context. They didn't see it in isolation as a technology. They saw it as a potential tool compared to other tools that existed at the moment. They all wanted to see regulation, and a lot of them doubted whether there was the political will, but they also all argued that this would be something that would have to be overcome, not just public support, but political will for such technologies. Now, as I said, we did this research in order to try and start a conversation about gene drive technologies in the UK. And our feeling is that conservation is the area where it's most likely to happen in the UK rather than agriculture. And so this is a very early piece of research. And from that, we made a short film, which we're showing in Exeter at the theatre in November. And that film will be available online from the 10th of November, which features some of our stakeholders from this work talking about how they're wrestling with this technology and some of the issues. So I can certainly put the link to that film in the chat for anyone who would like to follow up and understand more about the research we've done here.
Thank you, Sarah. And it's really, you know, when we look at citizen engagement around, say, GMOs in agriculture, there's a lot of data around there. A lot of people have some knowledge about that. But it's interesting to me that people who maybe didn't know so much about gene drives were still asking quite deep questions about how they work and what the implications are and what the context was in which they were using them. And these are the questions that come from a different expertise from, say the developers. And the developers might find them to be quite awkward questions, but they're actually really essential questions. So thank you very much for sharing that. And please do put the link to the film in the chat. Our next speaker is Ina Bartman. Ina is the director of GMO Free Norway Network. It's an umbrella organization of non-governmental organizations and corporations that represents 1.7 million consumers. And Norway is really unique in that it takes lay perspectives into account in the assessment of GMOs. And Ina is currently a member of a committee that looks at that and can speak with some authority about how that system works. So Ina, please welcome.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you for inviting us. I'm the coordinator within the network, as you say, and the network is a broad alliance of 18 farmer, environmental, consumer and solidarity groups. And we have been working together for more or less 20 years now. And in the last years, we have also started to work on gene drives. Our aim is to ensure freedom of choice for consumers and also for food producers. But we are also very clear that labeling and the right to choose is not enough. So our position is that if a GMO can harm health or nature, it's not our responsibility to say no. The responsibility is mainly belonging to the government, and they should prohibit it because such GMO should not be allowed in the market at all. I have to read because of the English, so I have a manus here. So far, no GMOs have been approved in Norway, neither for cultivation nor for import for food or feed. Only some flowers, some blue carnations, are permitted to sell. And up to now, there has been a broad national consensus that a restrictive GMO policy is necessary. But of course, the debate on gene editing and the new GMOs is also going on here in Norway. And therefore, the government has appointed a public committee, as Pat said, and our mandate is to assess GMO in a broad perspective and to give recommendations for further regulation. I am one of the 12 members in this committee, and we are expected to publish our report in June next year, and then the report will be sent on a broad consultation to all organizations, to institutions and other stakeholders. And they will be invited to give input, but also to express their primary opinion. And my position is that the Norwegian GMO regulation needs some amendments regarding the new methods of gene modification, but that the fundamental principles and guidelines should remain. So I'm very clear that all types of GMOs, the old and the new, as we call them, must be regulated within the law and case by case. The reason why Norway still is a GMO-free country is very much thanks to the Norwegian Technology Act that came into force in 1993. And I was asked by Pat to explain what is special with our regulation and how it has been managed in a way that made it possible to involve the public. As you know, Norway is not a member of the European Union, but we are closely connected through the European Economic Area. Norway's GMO regulation is in accordance with the EU regulation regarding effects on health and environment, but the Act also includes 3 more criteria. And these criteria are ethics, sustainability, and benefits to society. And the wide-ranging set of assessment criteria gives Norway more latitude when it comes to final GMO decisions compared to other countries in the European Union. So the purpose of the Genome Technology Act states that production and use of GMOs must take place in an ethically justifiable and socially acceptable manner in accordance with the principle of sustainable development. And I will share with you one example on how the requirements were managed during the national process we had on the maize 1507. I think you probably know the maize. It's the maize line that is conferred resistance to the pesticide glufosinate ammonium. And this pesticide was withdrawn from the Norwegian market already in 2008 due to adverse effects on health and the environment. And in 2017, the government concluded that the maize would not represent an increased risk for health or environment in Norway. But despite that, the government decided to prohibit the maize. And important to note, they wrote that the ethical considerations alone were sufficient grounds for prohibition in this case. So we were, of course, very happy with that conclusion. The public discussion about this maize started already back in 2003, and the GMO network always claimed that sustainable development must be regarded in a global context. That is the only way to do it. So our message was that to prohibit use of a pesticide in our own country, but at the same time import products where the same pesticide has been used is unethical and represents double standards. So in the public consultation, all 3 retailers and the trade union and all members in our network said that importing this maize from countries where glufosinate had been used would be unethical and therefore unacceptable. And ethics is a key issue because the prohibition of the maize also had to be in accordance with Norway's obligations under the WTO agreement. And the World Trade Organization, they actually say that national authorities are allowed to prohibit products if this is deemed necessary to protect public moral. And this is in GATT, the Article 20A. So in the government's, and of course, how should we define public moral? That is essentially. And in the government's decision, the following topics are mentioned relevant for people's considerations: solidarity with farmers in developing countries, farmers' rights and patenting on seeds, and last but not least, the need for more sustainable food systems. The government also wrote that no stakeholders in Norway had said they wanted to use the maize. So the government therefore also concluded that the maize did not represent any benefit to the Norwegian society. So they listened to the stakeholders as well there. So I will sum up by saying that we are happy to have a GMO regulation in Norway that makes it possible for the government actually to listen to the citizens. And we know when we listen to you, especially after Brexit, that we are very privileged to have a law where a guiding principle is that decisions should reflect the people's moral views and ethical norms. So I will stop here. Thank you for your attention, and I will be happy to answer if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ina. Just a small anecdote: when we gave oral evidence to the Public Bill Committee here in the UK about, what would help make the bill better. and the terror on their faces when we said that ethical considerations had the same weight as scientific considerations was palpable in the room. I mean, this is a very challenging way of assessing GMOs if you're a developer, because again, you're bringing in a lot of different questions that maybe they don't have quite such pat answers to. But I'd like to move on to Doug, because Doug, you've had some really important experience in this. Doug Parr is our Chief Scientist and Policy Director at Greenpeace in the UK, where his focus is climate change and new technology, including nanotechnology. And Doug was in the early 2000s a co-organizer of NanoJury UK, a deliberative jury process which fed citizen perspectives into the decisions rather, of the UK government's nanotechnology group. So Doug, welcome, and thank you for coming to the webinar today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and good to be able to share some thoughts on this. So I will talk about NanoJury, of course, but I've also been involved in other participatory exercises, including the citizens jury that we helped run on GM in the late 90s, and I was on the oversight panel for the Climate Assembly in the UK, and I've been asked to be part of various other groupings in recent years. So I'll have some observations about where I think this fits into the kind of NGO discourse, for want of a better term, and the NGO thinking about how to influence areas of policy. So maybe the first thing to say is that I mean, if you're engaged in organizing one of these things, don't do it lightly. It's got to be done properly, or don't do it at all. There's two reasons for that. One is that to have some purchase on government, if you're focused on government, and I suspect many of them will, then you'll need a robust methodology. And the other reason is that you have to take the time and energy that people are giving to this, the jurists or the assembly. You've got to take that seriously. It's not something to be abused. They're taking time out of their lives in order to do this. And one of the things I have observed in a lot of circumstances is that the jurists tend to be kind of left a little bit hanging at the end of it. They produce their outcomes and their recommendations, and then there's not quite sure what to do with it or where to go with it, and that needs to be thought about as well. But why did we engage with NanoJury? So this was a citizens jury. It was done in Halifax in 2005-06. It was, if you like, on the back of the controversies that had been around GMOs in the late 90s, early 2000s, because it felt like at the time the whole idea of what should get funded and why, in whose interest, to what benefit, to what end, was opening up within the scientific and technological domain. It was clear that the controversy over genetic modification had really shaken the British establishment to its roots in the science and technology domains anyway. So maybe there was a possibility through the lens of nanotechnology to steer the whole enterprise onto something that was slightly more positive. It didn't do that. Let's be upfront about it. We did good work. I think it was an excellent project. It did not achieve that, and I'll come back to why towards the end. The way we thought we'd do it was twofold. And these are two kind of different ways of trying to use a citizens jury to change things. And maybe the first question is, why would you do a citizens jury or something equivalent, a public participation exercise in the first place? Because it was always clear that whatever a citizens' jury is going to come up with, it's not going to be fully reflective of Greenpeace's policies, right? They're not going to just see what Greenpeace says and sign off on it and says, yeah, that's right. They're going to be challenging to us as well as to the people we're pointing it at. So why would you do it? And I guess the first point is, one should have a reasonable level of confidence that a balanced and well-informed participatory exercise is going to be pretty challenging to the status quo. That, I would say, is the number one question. Is this going to be right? And that's a judgment. Obviously, it's a judgment. The way we thought we'd do it with nano jury was twofold. One, we would try and get the relevant government department involved, and get them to actually be on the oversight panel and participants. And the other was to try and get it popularized through the media as an exercise, an interesting exercise in science and technology. So effectively, one is the policy process, and the other one is the outside process of trying to use it as a way of changing public viewpoints, a bit like how Michel described in that example that he gave from Mali. That if it becomes an issue of public discussion, then that very process actually helps what you're trying to achieve in policy terms. So we actually got a media partner with The Guardian. Rather to my surprise, the Institute of Nanotechnology in Cambridge agreed to sign up, and we got another academic institution, Newcastle, to participate as well. We ran the jury. It was very good. They came up with some sensible recommendations about how nanotechnology should be taken forward, which loosely speaking were around more public participation as the technology developed. Consumer benefits need to be factored in, the sort of thing you would actually kind of expect from minus the agricultural part, the sort of things you'd expect from a jury on GM. So did it succeed in changing policy? From at one point looking like it would, actually it didn't. And I think the reason is that the institutional forces that keep things the way they are were probably stronger than we expected. Well, let's be clear, they were stronger than I expected. Whilst there was an openness within some parts of the civil service, actually within the decision-making structures higher up, and certainly within the technology-based or science-based institutions like the Royal Society and so on, I think there was a great deal of resistance to actual change as distinct from talking about change. In part, that was because we got really unlucky with The Guardian, who were the media partner. They had a reorganization just as we were doing it, and our internal sponsor disappeared. So the location where we were going to get a lot of coverage and the person who was going to do a lot of the covering just vanished. I still regret that, but there was nothing we could do about it. So I do think there can be moments when an NGO-led process or an NGO participatory process can actually throw down that challenge, but you need to be really clear that how you think that's going to happen, and whether you're kind of going outside for media and wider attention. I think, remember, the nano jury was before the era of social media, and I think that would have been possible to run it in quite a different way and wouldn't have been so dependent on The Guardian now had we been running it at the moment. And I also think, because I've been approached for participation in various participatory exercises since then, most recently by the government on biomass in power stations, that one can also take a pretty cynical view about why government might want to engage in these processes. because I referred at the beginning to a well-run process and the importance both morally and practically of having a well-run process. It's also possible to run them badly and get the result you want, in quotes. We did have a fairly strong suspicion that that was what government was doing around this biomass process. I was talking to other NGOs within the coalition who are very worried about biomass right across the board, from RSPB to Biofuel Watch. And I thought it was interesting that our instinctive response was that they're going to stitch this up. And it's not hard to see how these kind of things could be stitched up. But nonetheless, NGOs will be asked to participate as a kind of veneer of acceptability. I think in practice that that biomass one, for what it's worth, probably was okay. And in the end, one of our colleagues from our friends from RSPB did participate, and I think it was probably okay. But it doesn't tell you that. Whilst I think citizen participation, public participation has tremendous value in the right place at the right time, done in the right way, one should also, for the reasons that I've outlined, approach it with considerable caution and care, because if you set up a new process, it's a hell of a lot of work. And the thing that frustrated me about nanojury was that we were running on a string and on a wing and a prayer, and actually there seemed to be more money around for academics to study what we were doing than to actually spend on the project itself, which was a bit ironic. Anyway, I'll stop there.
That's an interesting place to stop. Thank you, Doug. Wow, a lot of things have been raised there. Lawrence, can you put your camera on, please? If you're there? No? Okay. So there you are.
I'm just reading the stuff. Yeah. Trying to find where to start.
Yes, well, they all of our panelists have kind of segged quite nicely into each other in terms of the issues that they've raised and the complications, I think, around involving the public as well. But maybe you could start a little dialogue for us, if you would.
Okay, well, just a very quick, just to deal with one of the quick questions, because I couldn't keep up with typing. Adrian Ely asked about the where the current genome editing technology bill is in the process. It's coming up for its third reading, report stage in the House of Commons. There isn't yet a date, but it's likely to be within the next 2 to 3 weeks. It will get through almost certainly with limited, if any, amendments, where it goes to the Lords, within the 3 weeks after that. The government had the hope of getting it passed and royal assent before Christmas. That seems to be not going to happen, but it might happen before the end of January. So just to tick that question off. The second part of Adrian's question is have we been seeking inclusive participatory approach in decision making around genome editing, and what kinds of approaches would the panelists advocate in participatory decision making in the UK or elsewhere, which leads to my bringing a number of things together, a number of questions together, which is leading off from Doug's point about juries, citizen engagements can be run badly, and it's important to get things done at the right place, the right time, the right methods, and so on. Which from Michelle's comments, the experience in Mali was that that was the right time in Mali. There was a political and policy culture to accept that, to accept that process. There was a culture and a willingness within the media, within the public culture generally, to accept that process. I think the question, which I guess Adrian was linking at, and to ask you all, is if that culture is not there in the policy debate, is it best, as Doug might have been implying, to leave citizen juries and sort of landmark promoted citizen juries to one side and find some other way of citizen engagement? That's one question. And if so, what might that other form of engagement be? I don't mind who starts with that, answering that question, any of you, but because I'm going to come to you all. But
yeah, if I could come in on this, shortly after we completed the first phase of the Mali jury process, because the process went on for several years. It was quite a complicated, multi-layered participatory process, but the recommendations had an impact in the region, and the decision of the Malian government to pull out of the GM legislation off attracted a lot of attention in Burkina Faso, a neighboring country, and the organizers of the Mali citizen jury were approached by farmer groups, NGOs, and scientists in Burkina Faso, asking us to do the same thing or facilitate a similar process in Burkina Faso. We started looking into this and collectively decided, no, it wasn't safe to do that because basic civic rights were not being upheld. There was no freedom of press, there was no freedom of assembly, and there were real risks for people who would have dissenting voices. So the citizen jury process that was envisaged for Burkina Faso did not go forward for that reason. It was felt the political context was too perilous for people in Burkina Faso who would be involved in it. The conditions were not ripe.
okay, and did you consider, Michelle, doing some other form of citizen engagement, sort of smaller
Yes,
focus groups, or?
we did, but not in Burkina Faso. What in the subsequent phases of our participatory process, there were some full-blown citizen juries on the governance of agricultural research and priorities for research. And this is following the recommendations made by farmers in the first citizen jury. To everyone's surprise, they pointed the finger at research as being problematic, and research had to be re-governed and reoriented. So following that mandate from the farmers, the facilitators organized a couple of citizen juries which were regional in focus. They weren't just anchored in Mali. They involved farmers from Burkina Faso, Niger, Senegal, Benin, etc. And that allowed farmers from Burkina Faso to say a lot of things that they probably would not have been able to say in their home country. And it was, broadly about the future of food and farming in West Africa, including in their country. So that's how we got round it. And it was safe to do that in Mali in 2010, 2011. Today, it would not be the case because of the civil strife in Mali.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, oh, sorry.
No,
sorry, Michelle. Sarah, do you want to add to that? And maybe specifically, or I comment on that, but specifically is the way you've done this, I like the term knowledge, did you say knowledge co-production or knowledge co-creation? So it's a nice term. So are you doing it in this kind of way to bring something else, a different tone, different thing, or is it because you didn't see citizen jury as previously developed the right way forward?
Yeah, so this approach I'm taking in the area of gene drive, it's been in response, I think, to very similar conditions that Michelle is just describing in Mali. So some of the work I've been doing on the gene drive mosquito has been in Mali, Uganda, and Burkina Faso. And there, one of the biggest challenges is independence of the research. So some of the engagement work that has gone on has either been led by the technology developers or by the funders of the technology. And that's problematic. So thinking about and when you have there's very little media debate around gene drive in these three countries, even though these three countries are likely to be hosting the world's first trial of a gene drive organism. So that engaging publics in those spaces is critical, but doing so independently will also be critical. And as Michelle just described, the political context in those two countries, Uganda, Mali, and Burkina Faso, is such that it's extremely difficult to run any independent public engagement exercise. So it's very different to the UK context. I know Adrian's question was more about the UK context, but I just wanted to follow up on Michelle's point there. We take for granted that there is some independence around public debate here in the UK. But certainly, I think there are two primary reasons for engaging. One is because it's a democratic right. Two is because we want to make a better technology, and the more knowledge, breadth of knowledge you have shaping it, the more chance you have getting a technology which solves the problem. And lastly, it may be simply to get support for your technology. Support for technology is not one I think any of us would advocate. So we're left with a sort of democratic rationale for engagement, or what I would call the efficacy argument for engagement. And my work in gene drive has fallen along that efficacy one. It's recognizing there are different kinds of knowledge by people in these areas where we're training agriculture, conservation, etc., global health, and trying to bring that range of knowledge in helps us see the problem more fully and gives us a better chance of our technology solving the problem. So independence, I think, and just looking at the different motivations for engagement, I think will be critical.
Thank you.
Can I pop in, Lawrence, for a minute?
Sure.
That'd be all right, because there's a question in the Q&A from Roshan, which is saying that she's recently read an article discussing statutory limitations of regulatory bodies in the US, not being legally able to consider ethical and cultural concerns in their assessments. And the question is, to what extent is that a global problem, and how can we create meaningful operationalization of public engagement with those kind of bottlenecks? Do you have a comment on that, Sarah? And does anybody else have a comment on
I
that?
do. I'd say that's completely standard. Yeah, it's a global norm. Certainly in Burkina Faso, it's the norm, and the regulatory assessment of the gene drive of the genetically modified mosquitoes there included a public consultation, but only on the scientific aspects. And it was not transparent, it was not published. In Europe and in America, they will publish, and in fact in Canada and various other countries, they will generally publish that consultation, but you're not allowed to respond as a member of the public or a citizen to that consultation with any concerns that fall outside of the very narrow scientific criteria which the risk assessment is focused on. So there's very little room for public debate in the risk assessment process within the regulatory frameworks. Public debate has to happen outside of that context.
But this seems somewhat different maybe in Norway, and you have your hand up as well.
Yes, I totally agree that you need the political climate before you actually go into with a lot of resources to discuss how we could change things. We are happy in Norway to have that, but we experience now that all the processes we are invited into is very, very narrow. It's to discuss if these new methods are precise or not. STN1, STN2, is it precise, is it not precise? So when we are invited, we always ask, or we actually demand that we should have the bigger pictures and always ask what kind of problems are we actually talking about? What problems do we want to solve? And what are the alternatives to GMO? Which alternative strategies do we have for food sovereignty, food security, and so on? So we have been tougher and tougher because, of course, it's very important to go into this, dive into this debate that it's not that precise as the scientists say it is. And so we have to do that as well. But that is not subjects where we manage to mobilize the citizens. This is a debate for very few persons. So to big alliances, I think the only way to actually change the politics is to big, broad alliances and to push the governments, which country you live in. So, and I think that is the success in Norway. We have managed to stay together with all the farmer organizations and the consumers and the retailers. And we try to do that with the organizations we work with in the South as well, to build the alliances. So, but the questions we are asked now to discuss is so narrow and so based on dependent research. So, yeah.
Thank you. But the so coming back, Doug, to your point about right conditions, right, so on. You know, I mean, how is there? Do you have an overview of is there a kind of a checklist, a protocol to determine, or is there a model to determine what the right conditions would be? I mean, do these conditions to have a citizen panels or juries exist in the in the UK to look at genome editing, for example? Do you see that?
Well, there is not to be reliant on a person's and organisation's instinct as to what is going to be the right thing, because I would very much endorse what Ina just said about the way in which there is this constant pressure to sort of define the issue as being narrow technocratic terms around something fairly small. I mean, if you want an example of that, it's going on right now around fracking, where the attempt is to define it as being about the level of earthquakes that's acceptable, and actually leaving out kind of climate change, air pollution, whether this is the right direction, what about all the stranded assets, who's going to pick up the tab, where does the liability sit? All of those questions are just being ignored for the purposes of just trying to talk about which size of earthquake is acceptable. And you see the same thing going on with, exactly the same thing going on, it seems to be, with gene editing. So can an exercise in public participation, whether it's very large, very small, there are a range of techniques, and I'm not actually expert in them, everything from focus group, citizens jury, to something very large like the climate assembly. Can one of those techniques, done properly, help to lever open the narrow technocratic framing that is being delivered in a politically salient way? So is it possible to run a citizens jury, for the sake of argument, in a way that helps lever apart the way the government is trying to purely focus this to be around safety of gene editing, and not about direction of travel of agriculture, who will use this, to what purpose, with what ends, with what liability, and who picks up the tab, and how will people have continued control over the technology when it starts to deviate to different purposes? And I think, for me, at the moment, yes, it would such a process would do that. But we've seen in the last couple of weeks that the UK government is actually deeply ideological and will take a lot of turning around. So there's also a kind of cost-benefit analysis to be done here about whether this is something that's going to be effective in the context of where they are.
Okay, thank you. Lots of people. I mean, we've had a number of comments about independence and ethics, and now, Doug, you've just introduced risk. and risk assessment, risk benefits. The thing is that it seems, is it not a really grey area between so-called scientifically based risk assessment or views of scientific technology with one's worldview and one's set of values, if you like, one's ethical framework. So when you sit down in, say, as Sarah outlined, discuss gene drives over squirrels, there is what might be a narrow technical view about that, but your view about squirrels and conservation is also part of your worldview about what is nature and so on. And we've seen in the UK over genome editing, and I think we're seeing this in the EU over genome editing, where one's views of technology, is there any independent science or any independent view of technologies that can be divorced from worldviews? They can't, surely. So if we talk about ethical views, and Liz O'Neill raised a question in the chat about how do you ensure alternatives are considered, which raises the question of, who considers them alternatives and the necessity of them. How do you balance this in a jury? So, question to you, Sarah: is your focus meetings? How do you deal with this co-production to ensure that you're not actually enhancing conflict, not creating more conflict between technologically expressed worldviews? Or are you overtly seeking consensus? And how do you do this? Does a citizens' jury or citizen engagement, where there is conflict over the technology within society, seek consensus or just exchange of knowledge?
Well, I think conflict's good, firstly. I think conflict is where change happens. So if you look at risk assessment and the narrowing down of input into risk assessment, for example, if you look at the genetically modified mosquitoes in the USA, it became highly politicized, and the citing of the trial sites in Florida became a question on the presidential ballot. It was that politicized. So there was conflict. And I think I'm not seeking for consensus in any of the work I do. I'm looking to understand the diversity of views. And I also, as a researcher, try not to have an opinion on whether the technology is good or bad, but I do have very strong opinions on whether I think the process of decision making is good and bad. And a process of decision making which is narrow and limits the scope of what people can talk about, in my opinion, is not a robust decision-making process. But I do think conflict's good, and I think the more conflict we can have, the better. Protests, we talk about citizens' juries, but of course, the GM became an issue, a politicized issue, because people protested, not because there was a citizens' jury that highlighted concerns. So I still think there is great room for diversity and for plain old political protest as a way to get things done.
And Liz's question about how in this process you ensure that alternatives are considered, is that something that again needs this outside a political consensus that you're considering alternatives, or is that something that can emerge during the jury or the assembly or the engagement process?
I think it's fair to say that with all mini publics, whether it's citizen juries, consensus conference, deliberative polling, scenario workshops, or citizen assemblies, there is a fair degree of fatigue on the part of people who've tried to convince or bring about change. And it's interesting that a number of groups are actually saying that new legislation should be introduced to make it mandatory for decision makers to debate on the conclusions and recommendations of these mini publics. So, for example, in France, there's a group of lawyers, citizens, and scientists who have now proposed some pretty pioneering new legislation that would commit the government to, 1, review the outcomes of deliberative processes, 2, debate on the policy recommendations made by citizens, and 3, explain any significant differences of opinion between the government and the view of citizens. So this is really strengthening forms of accountability which are absent in, in a trajectory of representative democracy in which we have more and more manifestations of democratic deficits. So I think people who have been working on opening spaces for citizens and lay publics to come up with plural views to inform decisions realize there have to be some institutional changes for governments to actually listen, consider, and respond to the outcomes of these mini publics. Australia is another example where groups like New Democracy, the New Democracy Foundation, insist that the outcomes of any deliberative process or forum be subject to a free and open debate, as well as a subsequent vote in Parliament or by another relevant decision-making body. And I think these institutional innovations are pretty key, because going back to the point Doug made, this is very demanding on citizens, and one should be very careful not to raise expectations, to, mobilizing, organizing mini publics when they're quality processes, when they're inclusive, require a lot of work and a lot of commitment on the part of participating citizens. And there have to be some guarantees that their voice be heard at the end. Quite a few citizens who've participated in these mini publics have been very upset to see that all their work, all their good thinking, and some of it has been excellent thinking, reframing issues away from technocratic dimensions to include many other things, very sensible stuff, is just cast aside by governments who are increasingly unaccountable. So there's something that needs to happen at that level. If one stays within the framework of representative democracy, I mean, there may be other routes in exploring more open, direct forms of democracy, but that could be a conversation for another day. But I think that's pretty important, so that, citizens have some guarantee that whatever work they've generated, whatever ideas, whatever recommendations have been produced by these mini publics, in which they've been very willing participants and often very able participants, are actually heard at the end of the day by the so-called decision makers. And those decision makers can be in government, but also in scientific institutes, or in planning bodies, or in NGOs. It's across the board.
Okay, I'd like to follow up and ask you about that further, but just a couple of points. Several people in the chat or in the Q&A have asked about the science and where we are in terms of scientific knowledge related to genome editing, where the scientific controversies are, and so on. And I think Pat has posted some links to various documents, and Enya's also posted links to documents for that. Dietrich took me to task about that I shouldn't mix ethics and worldviews. I think there's overlaps, but I'll just pass that on in case you missed it in the chat. My follow-up question, to what you've just said, Michel, but Enya, did you have your hand up to make a particular point, or was that you want to come in now?
I can wait. It was about conflicts or consensus, but I wait. Go on.
No, do that.
Yeah, because we as a network are not against GMOs in general. And of course, if consensus is possible, it's nice. But I think the main challenge we have is to actually show the conflicts, who earns and who loses. And not, when we talk about GMOs in general, I think we should point out the specific GMOs and ask. So when we ask about what are the alternatives are very often very simple solutions because, for instance, food security, there is plenty of food in the world if it was more fairly distributed. So that is all this pressure that we have to use the gene editing to produce enough food. It's not true, but we have to also focus on that big picture. So what are the problems we want to solve? That is the question we should ask over and over again. And there are conflicts all the way. It's what it's about, actually. Thank you.
Okay, and on that point, following on from that, I'd just like to point out that David King, who works in human GMOs on the sort of issue to do with so-called designer babies, has posted a link in the chat that some of you might be interested in. The question I wanted to ask, coming back to this issue of different publics, there's no one public, no one group of citizens. And of course, you know, we all have different roles as citizens. Can I ask you all your views about if you participate in for example, if you participate in a forum as a stakeholder, i.e. whether you're a farmer or a processor in a discussion about GM technology in its application to food processing or to agriculture, should you also be participating, or can you also participate as a citizen? Well, how do you should the process recognize these different roles, and how does it deal with, or should the process, or can it deal with the process of proxies like NGOs as proxies for citizens' voices, or company associations as proxies for individual company views, or whatever? How does one deal with these and get clarity about these multiple roles that citizens can play? Do you see, all of you, I mean, please answer, what's your thoughts about how the process, should it differentiate, can it differentiate? How do you ensure transparency in this? Doug, do you want to kick off?
Well, I don't have a sort of simple answer to that, but I was on the oversight panel of the Climate Assembly, which was a project run by Parliament, in fact, to get about 120 citizens to debate responses in the UK to climate change. On the oversight panel, I did sort of find myself switching between modes of kind of the citizen who knows a bit about participatory exercises, trying to make sure there was integrity in the process, because we had, well, bluntly, two right-wing think tanks who were coming up with some extraordinary stuff, and there needed to be some pushback, but also as the kind of NGO person who, you know, wanted to see their own view properly expressed. And I don't think there was a, you know, my experience there was that you tend to oscillate between modes, which is probably not ideal, but I think it's just the nature of being human that you can't inhabit two places at the same time. But I mean, you know, I tend to feel I did a decent job, but that doesn't answer your question. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Sarah.
Yeah, it's interesting when you said, you know, can NGOs be a proxy for citizen views? I think NGOs have knowledge about citizen views. So I think it's not just that they're representative, but actually, if we want to make, you know, if I wanted to bring people around the table, then I would say that NGOs are pretty tapped into what citizens, you know, certain citizen views are. And so it's not just that they're representative of people in a representative democracy, but they're actually important knowledge holders too. So I think that's just the point I wanted to make there. There is this tension between stakeholder, if you like, where you're seen to have political interests and stake in the issue, but stakeholders also hold knowledge, and that's really important in developing, you know, thinking about technologies and developing policies. And often interests are excluded from risk assessment or regulatory processes. whereas knowledge is included. So if we can think about holders of knowledge in those ways, then we might be able to bring that knowledge into those regulatory processes.
Yeah, I like the phrase holders of knowledge. Anya, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, I think it's very important to discuss also with the industry and the scientists that we don't agree with. I think we learn from each other and we actually push the scientists to have better answers. So, but the important thing, if you have this round table process ceremonies, it must be very transparent which interests are you there on behalf of, because we are all citizens and we should all be political animals, we say, and have conscious about consumer rights and everything. But so we think it's very good to have discussions with all type of stakeholders. And of course, if you look at European debate on GMO, or at least very many of the retailers, like the Coop, the corporation retailers, they are our friends, allies in these questions. So, but of course, you should always know who you're talking to, and especially what kind of economic interests are behind them.
Michelle?
Yeah, I think that as many different types of voices in the room is better. This is about diversity and inclusion and diverse ways of knowing. And those diverse ways of knowing, the knowledge of the scientist, the knowledge of the policymaker, but also the knowledge of a mechanic, a farmer, a citizen, they all co-create a larger type of knowledge, which you could call more collective forms of intelligence. So that's vital. I do also think that some mini publics allow for that differentiation by virtue of their design. For example, you can have a group of citizens who are mandated to hear and review evidence. And you can involve as specialist witness or resource people, members from industry, from scientific institutes, policy think tanks, NGOs, and they can give their perspective in their submission to a panel of citizens who are mandated to think through what they've heard, weigh up the pros and cons, and make a sensible set of recommendations on the basis of careful deliberation. And I think any citizen jury process or any mini public that excludes de facto a certain group should be suspect. You know, it would be completely wrong to exclude large-scale industry from discussions on farming technology. They need to be in the room, but they need to be in the room presenting their worldview, their technology, their programs, and open to questioning and cross-examination from ordinary citizens who rarely have a chance to ask questions that are vitally important for their own lives and the lives of their children.
Thank you. Bart, I think we're probably out of time here, are we? You're on mute, Pat.
I'm on mute, yes, and I've got way too many things open looking at questions and what have you. Thank you. We're certainly coming to the end of what has been a very rich and very full session. I hope we've managed to answer some of the questions that our audience have asked. What seems to me very clear, well, there's several strands, probably more than I can sum up quickly, but you know, outside of the GMO discussion bubble, we're seeing a deregulation agenda and an agenda that kind of excludes public views across a whole range of subjects. It's not just us that are being persecuted, you know, it's climate, it's energy, it's citizen rights. So this is an important discussion to have right now in the context of technology, but it's also an important discussion to have in the context of what it means to be a citizen in a world where things are changing very rapidly. And it really provokes questions about who gets to speak, who counts as an expert, and even more cynically, if there's a political expediency in making sure citizens feel that any effort they make to participate won't be worth the energy or the time. And in some ways you can see, we only mentioned protests very briefly in this discussion because we were talking about, you know, civil conversations, but you can see why people take to the streets. You can see why they disrupt, because in part protest feels like a more genuine expression of what they think and feel. And the problem, of course, is judging how impactful that is very difficult. But it seems clear to me, listening to what everybody has said today, that when we're considering science and technology, government as a kind of ethical and communal task in the way that we've been talking about today, that simply cannot happen without a range of disciplines, not just geneticists and technologists, but ethicists and social scientists and what have you. And in order to bring those people into the conversation requires a serious rebalancing of power and a redefinition of what evidence is. And I think a lot of people would who hold the power at the moment might feel very uncomfortable with that. And I was interested also to hear, I think, both Doug and Michelle bringing up the idea that it isn't just the other side. It's not just GMO developers or promoters who are uncomfortable with the notion of citizen engagement. A lot of NGOs would think twice about it as well, because there's no guarantee that citizens are going to say exactly what you want to say and that will work with your campaigns and your messaging and your Twitter account and your Instagram and all the other things that you use as a tool. So it's incredibly important when you enter into public dialogue, as Doug says, that it should be entered into with a degree of awareness. And nevertheless, I think that is the trajectory that we're heading for here. And certainly we, that is a bigger conversation and beyond GM, are really think now that what's happening in Norway is replicable and interesting, and really should be something that we should be looking at in this country as well. And that we might even like to see the creation of a kind of observatory of citizen engagement to help establish how we engage the public in a way that is meaningful. And those are my initial thoughts on what we've heard today. I think there's a huge amount of food for thought here. The optimist in me hopes that somebody will hear it and maybe we can move forward with this, but we'll see. Anyway, thank you very much to all of our panelists who've taken the time to join us today. For our audience, we will be sending out the video link to this as soon as it's available. So we'll keep in touch and we'll let you know when the next event is coming.